Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Good evening and welcome to the final Mary Talks of the academic year. My name is Mike Charnoff, and I am the immediate past president of the Alumni Board, and I am a proud member of the class of 1995. It's my pleasure to introduce everyone tonight, and I want you to know that we're being sponsored this evening, if you will, by Mary Wash Giving Day, which is being held this year on March 20th. Giving Day is a unique opportunity to support Mary Washington and to really ensure the continued success of programs like this one, like Mary Talks, and similar programs that we run. And for our audience watching at home, we want you to know that you can make a gift on March 20th, and you can do so by visiting givingday.umw.edu. So if you have questions about this event or you want to learn about other ways to participate, for those of you in the room with us tonight, please visit our table here in the lobby and during tonight's dessert reception. Thank you in advance for your continued support. And I recognize a number of the folks in the room tonight, and I know that we have folks who have been supporting this institution that we have so much affection for many years. So now on to tonight's main event, Michael Spencer's Mary Talk about designing of Mary Washington, the legacy of architect Charles M. Robinson. Michael Spencer is currently an associate professor in the Department of Historic Preservation here at the University of Mary Washington, as well as the director of the UMW Center of Historic Preservation. Professor Spencer received his Bachelor of Arts in Historic Preservation from right here, Mary Washington College, in 2003. Fellow alum, and we were chatting right before we started. He knows my wife, who's class of 2004, so I love the small world connection. Professor Spencer went on and received his MHP from the University of Kentucky. And while much of his research and teaching involves building conservation here in the United States, Professor Spencer's interest in conservation efforts in the United Kingdom began while attending Mary Washington College. So his other research has involved developing non-destructive technologies such as infrared thermography, as well as exploring the use of 3D modeling in cultural heritage applications. His classes and interests have also provided the opportunity to delve into local Fredericksburg building history, as well as the documentation of historic agricultural structures within the Rappahannock River Valley. So in addition to serving as an associate professor and center director, Professor Spencer has also assisted the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park on Section 106 compliance. Thank you, Professor. And he's a board member of the Washington Heritage Museums, and he serves as the UMW Campus Preservation Officer, and is also vice chair of the Fredericksburg Memorials Advisory Commission. That's a lot of hats to wear. Well, we try to get it right. Professor Spencer was also recently appointed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Advisory Board for the creation of preservation plans for America's historically black colleges and universities. And past projects have also included buildings such as the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, the Mary Washington House here in Fredericksburg, and the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Alexandria. And his work has also involved documentation of Westminster Abbey in London. So, without further ado, we all have the pleasure of having Professor Spencer here on campus with us, and I want you to please give him a warm welcome.
I'll grab the clicker from you. Thank you so much, Mike. All right, well, I want to start out by thanking everybody for coming, braving the cold, the windy weather. The last time I tried to give this lecture, it snowed, so we're doing a little bit better tonight than we did then. I'll jump right into it here. I don't mince words with my lecture. Obviously, we're going to talk about designing Mary Washington and the legacy of Charles M. Robinson. Now, I like to consider Charles M. Robinson kind of a lost architect. Not in the sense that he disappeared or went anywhere, but that we've just refound him recently. So we celebrated his 150th birthday last year. And because of that, as well as a lot of the universities kind of rediscovering their own architecture, Charles Robinson started to come to the forefront. And that was true here at Mary Washington as well, where he designed a number of our structures. And so what we have is an architect who was extremely prolific throughout Virginia, as well as Pennsylvania, designing all sorts of different buildings from residences to K through 12 schools, as well as a number of our institutions of higher education here in Virginia, including not only Mary Washington, but James Madison University. We have Longwood, which I always call Farmville, but we have those schools, as well as William and Mary, Virginia Union University, Radford, so the list kind of goes on and on. So very prolific designer. He didn't get his start here in Virginia, however. He got his start in Pennsylvania and then migrated here around 1906. However, he didn't come just because of the architecture and the jobs. He came because he had a lot of family here in Virginia as well. In fact, he was born in Hamilton, a small town in Loudoun County, Virginia, in 1867. And he was born to James T. Robinson and Elizabeth Crockett. Now, Elizabeth Crockett was from Pennsylvania, Altoona area, where James T. Robinson was a Virginia native. The two got married and had a number of children, Robinson being one of those children. Now, James Robinson started his career pre-Civil War as a building contractor in the Shenandoah Valley, served in the Confederate Cavalry, which is interesting because when he married Elizabeth Crockett, he must have known that she was distantly related to George Armstrong Custer. So you can imagine the family dynamic there. But regardless, they got married. After the Civil War, he continued to serve as a building contractor. So Charles Robinson was exposed from his birth to building materials, architecture, and the kind of general contracting business. However, things kind of dried up in the 1870s here in Virginia in terms of building, and they moved to Altoona, Pennsylvania. So this young man, 29 years of age here in this image, a little bit younger when he was in Altoona in the 1880s, that's where he discovered architecture. And he ended up interning with a visiting architect to the Altoona area called John Peebles. Now, some of you might know Peebles from University of Virginia, where he obtained most of his kind of fame and designed a number of his kind of high-profile structures. But Peebles was able to offer Robinson a well-rounded kind of hard knocks education. So he didn't go to a formal school, but rather trained under Peebles to learn about styles like the Beaux-Arts, to learn about neoclassicism, to learn about Richardsonian Romanesque, so a wide variety of different styles. And during his tenure at the firm and working with Peebles, he designed and helped design in a number of those different styles. And so here we have a kind of later example, 1893. This is after he left the firm. Well, this is the kind of work he would have been involved in. So here we have one of the early gymnasiums at UVA designed by Peebles and an engraving done in kind of the neoclassicism that would have been familiar to Peebles, but also familiar to Robinson. And of course, keep this in mind because this is the type of style that's going to eventually translate here at Mary Washington. Now, throughout the 1880s, he works under Peebles. He gets his feet wet in architecture, building design. And then in the late 1880s, he kind of goes at it alone. He tries his hand as a single architect designer, not too successful. Then he partners with a man by the name of Smith. They create a kind of limited firm, and they do fairly well. They start to produce a number of pattern books, which was fairly typical at the time. So they'd sell these pattern books to people. You'd choose a design, you'd contact the architect, and you'd build your home, or in some cases, churches. So it was kind of back and forth between residences and churches, primarily in Altoona or Blair County, Pennsylvania. He continues doing this throughout the 1890s. He changes different firms. He gets his in-laws to underwrite him, get nice in-laws there, actually support him in terms of what he's doing. But he's able to kind of cobble together a number of different design books, a number of different firms, and becomes a fairly prolific architect in Altoona, Pennsylvania, designing hundreds of residences, designing a number of grade schools, as well as a number of churches. And just recently, Blair County actually did an exhibit on Charles Robinson that looked into he designed and built in Altoona, and the number is amazing. We're talking well over a couple hundred buildings in that area. And that's all for a 29-year-old, right? So he's doing a lot of stuff. But he gets his big break in 1904 when he partners with a man by the name of George Winkler. And George Winkler's name's not really important, but it's just important to know that he had help and assistance in terms of the firm he was working with. And they get their big break by designing or getting the commission to design Altoona High School. Well, Altoona High School you probably don't know about, probably haven't seen in all the architectural books, but it was a big structure and had a huge commission associated with it. In fact, it cost over $200,000 at the time to build. Keep that number in mind. I won't ask you to memorize a lot of stuff, but keep 200,000 and kind of their forethought there, because numbers are going to come back, because rarely is he going to hit that number again. So Altoona, 1904, $200,000. And he designs the structure with George Winkler, looking at the kind of Beaux-Arts with this wonderful dome. Who doesn't want a dome in their high school, right? We talk about the neoclassicism of this portico, right? We see that with the classical orders. And then almost the heavy-set nature of Richardsonian Romanesque with the stone and the kind of muted details of the stone. So he's kind of combining a lot of these different styles in kind of eclectic design here, really showcasing what he's able to do. Now, unfortunately for Robinson, the design starts in 1904. On 1905, they're building the structure, and there's an accident. He's on site with a number of very important people, and a truss falls very close to them, nearly killing the entire party, right? So not so great. And I love to show this newspaper article on my right here, your left. We talk about the truss falling, and then inadvertently, I didn't crop it correctly, and at the very bottom, you see boy's leg cut off by trolley. So as bad as it could get with the truss falling, it could always be worse, right? And so that poor boy had it there. But whether because of liability issues or because of health concerns, as stated in the other article I present over my head, he decides to move to Virginia in 1906. So just after all this happened, is it circumstance? I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but regardless, he's in Virginia. He's designing in 1906. And his first commission here in Virginia is Louisa County High School, right? And some of you are probably familiar with this structure if you've driven through the area before. Wonderful building. This structure cost $5,000 to build. So he goes from $200,000 to $5,000, but he gets his start in Virginia. And what's interesting about this structure is you can kind of see he returns back to some of maybe his earlier designs when he was working under John Peebles, where you get this kind of Richardsonian Romanesque, this low arch, the use of stonework. He incorporates large windows in all his designs, and that's something to remember whenever you look at Charles Robinson's buildings. That's because he was not a convert to gas lighting. He thought it was incredibly dangerous, which it is. Liked electric lighting, but electric lighting wasn't good at the time, so he used really natural light in his buildings. You got these really good, spacious kind of feels in the interiors of a structure. You also notice that below and above the first-story windows are these kind of panels, and that's reinforced concrete. So he's kind of adopting that technique and technology fairly early in terms of reinforced concrete's history. We have it here at Mary Washington, too. So keep those concrete panels in mind. Keep the large windows in mind, because those are going to be mainstays in his architecture kind of throughout his career. So throughout 1906 and 1907, he gets a variety of different commissions. He starts to design a lot of K through 12 schools, as well as residences, primarily in the Richmond area, but also across Northern Virginia and Southeast Virginia. Then in 1908, he gets his big break. And what also happens in 1908? Yes, Mary Washington, right? So the General Assembly, in its infinite wisdom, decides we need more teachers here in Virginia. So what do? Is they commission a normal school, a normal and industrial school in Harrisonburg, which becomes James Madison University, and they commission another one in Fredericksburg, which becomes the University of Mary Washington. And I might slip from time to time and say Mary Washington College, but I'm guessing that won't bother too many people, right? So we have those two institutions that are developed during that time. JMU is on the ball. They get to it right away. They hire Robinson to design their campus, so a big break for him. And what we have here is an early kind of watercolor that Robinson does for the campus at James Madison University. And what it showcases, I think, very nicely is his kind of adherence to bilateral symmetry. So if you kind of split the campus down the center, you could fold it on top of itself and it would match up very nicely. Well, that's reminiscent of another school in Virginia, right? UVA, all right? So you can see where he's kind of looking at that Jeffersonian collegiate, the Roman classicism, all the things that Jefferson was adapting at UVA to James Madison and his design. He's also looking inward with his structures, something we see here at Mary Washington, right? We're looking into the campus, and you very much see that on the lawn at James Madison University as well. We also get the style of architecture that he's designing in, where we're looking more at the neoclassicism or even the Jeffersonian collegiate or the Roman classicism that he starts to adapt with a lot of his subsequent structures and institutions of higher learning. So here we have Wilson Hall, which is a fantastic example of his kind of early start adapting neoclassicism, adapting Roman classicism to these institutions of higher education. And you can still make out some of those components that I asked you to kind of remember in the back of your mind. The large windows, right? We see those here. We also see the concrete panels underneath and above the windows as well. We're incorporating stone, which is more reminiscent of Altoona, but later he's going to transform that into brick with a number of his structures. So where does Mary Washington come in with this? Well, in 1908, James Madison's making great strides. We're still looking at where we're going to put our campus. Initially, the Buildings and Grounds Committee decides to put Mary Washington's campus north of town along Cedar Lane, which today would be Normandy Village or just near the Falmouth Bridge. So over in that vicinity. However, there is a party within Fredericksburg that's pretty politically astute that says we don't want it there. So they lobby the General Assembly, and they lobby successfully to have that site rejected. So in 1908, we had a site ready to go, and it was scrapped, and we had to start from square one. Luckily, one of the political entities that was so adept at lobbying the General Assembly had 45 acres on Marie Heights that he was willing to sell, right? So Captain Rowe decided to offer his plat, which we have the original one up here on my right, that shows the original 45 acres where the first buildings of Mary Washington were going to be built. Later, we were going to obtain other property plats. So on the lower, or my left over here, we've got the Almshouse plat, as well as the Reservoir plat that we'll obtain eventually as part of Mary Washington College, as well as a number of smaller lots where buildings like Westmoreland, George Washington Hall are located that took a little bit longer to kind of bring into the fold. Now, some things to remember about the site. Of course, at this time, it was outside of Fredericksburg proper, so it wasn't in the city limits. Of course, that was perturbing some of the city council members, and so the movement to kind of incorporate that area started from a fairly early date, but of course didn't really happen until 1940, 41. But we were on the edge of town. It was kind of a bucolic setting, and they advertised that as being beneficial to the young lady's health. Right? Good ventilation, you're out in the country, and there are some wonderful pictures, and I'll give a plug to the website later that Carolyn Parsons and others with special collections have scanned in, but it shows the young ladies hard at work doing their vegetable garden, and there's one young lady just standing in the middle looking at the camera kind of like, are you kidding me? I signed up for this? All right? So, you know, they're hard at work, they're doing this stuff. They're out in the country for the most part, but not far enough away that they can't go to church. That was a big deal, and not far enough away that they can't go shopping. So Rowe and the city fathers made sure that they were just close enough, and in fact even built a road to Mary Washington, Cornell Street. Okay, they wanted direct access to town, and that gave it to them. So here we also have an image that shows the kind of rural setting that Mary Washington was in, and this is an image from the University of Virginia Special Collections. They do have 3 or 4 images that show the campus in Willard Hall as it was under construction, so kind of a lucky find there. Now, once they selected the site on Marie's Heights, Rowe's property, they had to figure out who was going to design the campus. So they had a competition, try to get a number of architects to apply. They couldn't make up their minds. So what did they do? They decided to hire 3 architects. Well, you can imagine where that was going to go. And in fact, there were some architects who did not win the selection process, like John Peebles, Robinson's mentor, that complained bitterly about that process and said, hey, you're doomed for failure. Well, you know, they were kind of right. And here's a good example of that. So this structure, does anyone remember this from Mary Washington's campus? It's close. Actually, you really shouldn't remember because it was never built, but it is on the site, or was supposed to be, Monroe Hall. This is the Science Hall that was designed in 1909 by the three architects getting together. It was grossly over budget from day one, and they couldn't value engineer the thing down. So the three architect process, after about a couple months of designing, kind of fell by the wayside, and Charles Robinson emerged as the kind of primary designer, with Philip Stern and Charles Bryant assisting him in the design process. But this plan was scrapped in 1909, and it was back to the drawing board. Another issue they ended up having was where to actually place the structures on that 45 acres. So this animation shows the approach to Marie's Heights, shows the structures there. And what they were having trouble finding was flat ground, as well as appropriate orientation for the structures to obtain maximum sunlight, as well as ventilation. So here's a 1910 plan that, again, was scanned in by Carolyn Parsons and those in special collections, which shows how Robinson was evaluating sun angle, as well as direction, so that he could maximize that passive ventilation or cooling process, as well as the passive lighting system. Again, he didn't like gas lighting, so he needed natural light, and he was able to orient the buildings more or less on a north-south axis and give daylight to the majority of rooms. So I think like 90% of the rooms get some sun during the day, so pretty good in regards to that. He also developed a Dumbell Plan, which is akin to kind of tenement housing that they were doing in New York City. But the idea is he was adapting it for dormitory living. So again, to maximize the amount of sunlight and ventilation you're getting. You can see that with the outline I show in this image, where Virginia Hall is outlined in red, and you can really see that H plan or that Dumbell Plan. And what that allowed for is a structure that didn't quite have the massing that a traditional rectangular building might have. Now, the first building constructed on campus was Willard Hall. And sometimes that's confusing for people. A lot of people want to say Monroe Hall. But because of the problems associated with the Science Hall or Monroe Hall's initial design, Willard Hall was first to start construction. And that started in 1909. And here we have the actual builder's contract. And it's another little tidbit that I absolutely love, because when you look at where the architects are listed towards the bottom third of the contract, you see Robinson, Bryant, and Stern. And then above that, you see architect, and then they put in S, right? They weren't used to having multiple architects design these buildings. So they contributed to the process, although Robinson was leading that. The other thing you can note from that contract is the cost of the building, about $42,000. Again, 1908 versus the 1904 Altoona High School, right? You could have built the entire campus for what the Altoona High School cost, right? So we get a fairly modest structure that he's designing, Willard Hall. And here we have another one of those early images that shows the construction process taking place. Now, Willard Hall didn't have anything necessarily unusual about the construction. In fact, it was a little bit late to the game. There's bricks, right? We've been using bricks for hundreds of years. They incorporate actual stone in construction. And another interesting feature are cast iron columns. Well, cast iron columns, about the turn of the century, were starting to be phased out to make way for steel. But we still have them in two structures on campus, that being Willard Hall as well as Monroe Hall used cast iron. Some other features that are kind of unique in the design. I already mentioned the Dumbell Plan. You can kind of see it nicely here in the first floor plan layout of Willard Hall, where again, I outline in that kind of red dash. If you look really close and kind of squint, look sideways, you'll see the hallway and then only 2 rows of rooms. So those rooms would have transom lights or windows that would open onto the corridor, allow for borrowed lights so your hallway would be lit up, and you could open those transoms to actually create a positive flow through the building. So the idea is that you would use those passive ventilation systems to hopefully cool the buildings. Now, how well it worked, I don't know. They've sealed those up. But again, they were supposed to work well, and for the most part, these passive systems with the large windows did an okay job. And those of us who went to school here know that unless you did summer session, you're talking about a couple weeks where it's really unbearable, right? And you should be studying in the library anyway during that time. So you're not in your dorm room. Anyway, we have this Dumbell Plan. He also looks at the aesthetics and the classical orders that he's applying to the structure. So as you walk around campus, this is something to take note of. With Willard Hall, he uses the Ionic order with these volutes, those kind of ram's horns, at least that's what they look like. He's using those for Willard Hall, and he's using Doric order for buildings like Virginia Hall. These dormitories are these residences. And what he's saying architecturally is that they're a little bit subservient to the administration building, which will be constructed later using the Corinthian order. So he's using that kind of Jeffersonian classicism to subtly indicate the priority of buildings on campus. Now here we have a nice interior image showing the dining hall on the first floor of Willard. Now the renovation of Willard is going to take place in the near future, and one of the key components is to try to look at restoring these open spaces on the first floor. So I'm really excited about that. But historically it would have been the dining hall, and what you can see here is how much light is let in by those windows. So there are no lights turned on here. And those are electric lights. They weren't going to be that powerful. But you get enough light that you have the cameras there, they can operate, and obviously people can see what they're doing. The other neat thing you notice here are the cast iron columns, right? So you can see those. Those are metal. Again, fairly unique for Mary Washington. A little bit archaic, but still pretty interesting. The second building constructed on campus was Monroe Hall. And it was started more or less in 1910, a year before the school was supposed to open. Okay, so they were rushed from the outset. And so to make up for a little bit of lost time, Robinson, instead of being his usual kind of inventive self, decided to borrow from some other designs. And here we actually have the East Ward Public School at Radford, which predates by a few months Monroe Hall. You can start to see the similarities, right? So Monroe Hall is this, but a little bit larger. All right, so we get a larger version of the East Ward Public School. Again, a handsome structure, but kind of borrowing on some of the ideas. Again, he only had a couple months turnaround, so he had to look at other designs that he had developed. And what you'll notice with this engraving is that it embraces a lot of the same attributes we've already looked at. The large windows, the reinforced concrete paneling under the windows, that Roman classicism or Jeffersonian collegiate styling that we see. And in this case, we have the Corinthian order of capital or column utilized in our building construction. And here's the building shortly after it's finished, as well as one of the older terracotta Corinthian capitals that we actually have in the department's collection. So we did save that. But again, Corinthian order to demonstrate the hierarchy of the building at that time. And of course, another interior image, the actual first library at Mary Washington in Monroe Hall, which showcases, again, the borrowed-like concept. And so you can see in the back of the room kind of a series of windows. And those windows went to the corridor. I think they're painted over now, but went to the corridor. And then if you look really close, you can even see the windows on the other side. So you can completely see through the building. You could open those up, and you could kind of allow for that positive airflow to take place. The third structure, and really the structure that helped define what we think of as the kind of lawn or the plaza between Monroe, Virginia, and Willard, is the first unit of Virginia Hall, which was built in 1914, 1915. It's always planned for. It's essentially a mirror copy of Willard Hall, with the exception that it uses a Doric order, again, kind of a lesser order than the Corinthian. However, this is a kind of interesting facet of what Robinson did do with his design. If you couldn't afford to build everything at once, he'd kind of phase construction for you and plan ahead. So Virginia Hall, this is one of my all-time favorite images, right? Indoor baseball on the outside. Essentially, at this time, when this picture is taken, they already know that they're planning for a Unit 2, in addition to Virginia Hall. And if you look really closely at the structure, you'll see the archways in the middle. The idea was that you build those in, and then when you get that second unit in place, you knock it out. So again, not innovative in the sense of kind of groundbreaking, but just really smart design, right? He was just a really intelligent designer. And again, this is actually in the second unit, the second library on campus, but showing that borrowed-like concept. And of course, Virginia Hall does differ structurally in that it starts to use steel in construction rather than the cast iron columns. So just separated by a few years from Monroe Hall and Willard Hall. Another building that most of us probably don't remember or didn't even know existed, but also a Charles Robinson design, is the heating and laundry plant. Originally part of Willard Hall, it was designed in 1916. Initially supposed to be part of a larger building, which was never constructed. And it served in the capacity for a number of years until the 1940s when they built the heating plant on College Avenue. And I believe towards the end of its life, it was used as a greenhouse, and there were some other kind of biology classes that were taught in it. But interesting in the sense that it was using reinforced concrete. It was never meant to be seen as it currently looks in this image. It was meant at some point to have something like Willard Hall on top of it. And again, going back to plugging Carolyn Parsons' website, you can actually get on the website and look at the original plans for this building, and you can see the future extensions. Okay, so again, really interesting building. The smokestack also never really worked, so it was a disaster. Another building that Robinson designed on campus that we may or may not recognize is the old Alumni Building, which became the indoor pool for the university. So originally in the 1920s, the students and, again, alumni were pushing to have their own building. They even took out advertisements in the Freelance Star, and here we have George. It says Father George on his jacket, advertising for the Alumni Building, all right? So students are utilizing that, trying to raise money, and we have a rendering done by Charles Robinson that shows the structure as it should be. Like a lot of the, you're kind of getting the idea here. We always would build something and couldn't quite afford to bring it to completion. So poor Robinson, but this is what he got, right? This is the indoor pool as it looked in the 1920s. Far cry from the rendering, not much of Jeffersonian collegiate or classicism going on here, but it is brick, right? And we actually keep this structure. In fact, it's still in existence today. So this was the indoor pool. Later, they add the cast stone balustrades to it, and today, it's part of Lee Hall, which is added in 1951. And for years later, that room was referred to as the pool room or the swimming pool. And in a lot of cases, there are some nice reminiscence talking about it smelling like chlorine down there, right? So you have your office in the middle of the swimming pool. But again, a nice vestige left over from Robinson's, one of his early designs. The second unit of Virginia Hall was another building constructed and designed by Charles Robinson, this time in 1927. The second unit, again, was meant to have even a third unit added onto it. So nothing groundbreaking about it, but again, just continuing his architectural legacy and a kind of consistency in design throughout campus, which a lot of us appreciate about Mary Washington today. Here we have the second unit, kind of real time. Another building, Chandler Hall, which a lot of us remember just from a few years ago. This structure originally was designed as a K through 12 building. So it was a training school with, in this case, without the gymnasium that Robinson planned for. So again, another structure that wasn't able to bring to kind of completion here. So you can see it's kind of missing that design. Later in 1940-41, they're going to add the front portico. But another interesting aspect in design that he incorporates with this particular structure, and again, at this point in the 1920s, 1930s, he's well versed in educational design. And so what he has here is he builds in observational rooms. So student teachers can go in, they can look at the students through peepholes, and when necessary, they can raise up these partitions. And so here we have an early image showing that as well as the blueprints. And of course, the image that a lot of us are familiar with, the 1938 portico that's added by J. Binford Walford, which we'll discuss his architectural legacy kind of on the heels of Charles Robinson. And the last structure that's attributed to Charles Robinson is Seacobeck Hall. Of course, Seacobeck Dining Hall, designed in 1930 and built in 1930-1931, about a year before Charles Robinson passes away. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether this structure is actually his design or not, and that's kind of coming to fruition as we look and examine the documents. More than likely, he had a hand at it, but Seacobeck's a pretty unique design. It's got that curved portico. It's got this kind of polygon center piece, right, that doesn't quite fit in with a lot of the other kind of Robinson's designs that we see on campus. And in fact, when we look closely at the blueprints, we see designed by, and I'm sorry it's not clear, but it's designed by E.G.R. Well, that's not Charles M. Robinson. So somebody else is doing this. J. Binford Walford is reviewing the drawings, and his son, George Armstrong Robinson, is also participating in the design process as well as part of his firm. So by 1931, Seacobeck is on site at Mary Washington and really brings to close the kind of open lawn or that original intention that he had regarding Mary Washington's immediate campus, where you had Monroe, Willard Hall, and Virginia flanking, and then on access or close to on-access Seacobeck Hall. If you look real close, he's slightly off. Now, in 1932, I mentioned he passes away. His successor, J. Binford Walford, again, is pretty astute at the designs Robinson is doing, and is, again, well-versed in Robinson's intention on campus. And so the campus does a good thing and hires or continues to hire on the Robinson architecture firm run by J. Binford Walford at that time. That said, J. Binford Walford does adapt things to kind of his own taste, and so he takes Robinson's kind of subdued Jeffersonian collegiate and classicism and kind of puts it on steroids a little bit, right? So you see these large stone columns on a lot of J. Binford Walford's buildings. So structures like the 3rd unit at Virginia Hall. We see with Chandler Hall's portico, but also Ball Hall is a J. Binford Walford design. George Washington Hall. All of those with those large stone columns, that's J. Binford Walford. And that's his, kind of just subtle divergence from what Charles Robinson is doing. That legacy of Charles Robinson continues even into the 60s and the 70s with buildings like Jefferson Hall, where we don't get J. Binford Walford anymore, but we get Wright, Jones, and Wilkerson. And Wright, Jones, and Wilkerson is a firm that, again, is going to embrace the kind of classicism that Robinson started with and use it for a number of the structures on campus, as well as embrace the landscape that we're all familiar with, the open spaces, the kind of cloistered feel that you get, the inward-facing structures. And then even recently with the Stantec New Student Center, I think at some point we'll get a name associated with that. But the New Student Center here, you can think of as kind of Robinson and J. Binford Walford really on steroids, right? It's big, but it's linking back to that earlier place in time with his designs. So what I want to kind of end with here is just the understanding that as we move forward as the University of Mary Washington, we look at a lot of the new construction that's out there, there's always attention being paid to the legacy that Charles Robinson left, whether it's in something that looks really modern or whether it's something that kind of looks to mimic the past that Charles Robinson produced. It's always kind of at the forefront of design discussions. And so Robinson's legacy here is really distinct, and it continues on to this day. With that, I want to give my special thanks slide here to a number of people. First off, the students in my Department of Historic Preservation, second to none, have helped me throughout the years in doing a lot of my research, as well as my colleagues in the department. But Carolyn Parsons, who is here tonight at the University Special Collections, also a huge help in my research. Her and a number of her staff did the scannings of a number of these drawings and helped me find a number of the materials. I also want to give them a plug, their website. You can access this when you get back home, or if you're at home now watching on YouTube. Again, a great site to visit, digital collections, blueprints. And they also have an exhibit on the second floor of the Convergence Center that talks about Charles Robinson's legacy as well. So I encourage you to go up there and take a look. Also want to thank John Wiltonmuth, Vice President of Facility Services, for making a lot of his drawings available, as well as former Vice President Rick Pierce of Finance, and former President Rick Hurley, who really got this stuff moving with the preservation plan. And then, of course, David B. Robinson, Charles Robinson's grandson, who provided a number of the images. Michael Farrow from Blair County, Altoona area. And again, a lot of his research he shared with me. And of course, my wife and my daughter, who's the one that's been crying throughout this. But we know she's attentive, she's awake, and she's paying attention here. So with that, thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have. I think I was only a few minutes over here.
We do ask that you in the room wait for the microphone to reach you for questions, just so our audience at home can hear.
What was the function of the reinforced concrete panels in between the windows?
I think primarily aesthetic. So he was looking at that also as it was serving in somewhat of a structural capacity in replacing the brick that should have been there. But really looking at aesthetics. Good question, yeah.
Could you say what the first plan that was over budgeted of Monroe? I was just curious what was left out when Robinson redesigned for the Monroe we see today. What made the first one over budgeted?
Good question. It was really the size. So again, going back to the blueprints that you guys have so diligently scanned, what you'll notice is that the sheer size of the building, as well as the finishes. And we still have that problem today, right? Value engineering is something we're always looking at. If we're up to me, we'd have terrazzo everywhere. But that was one of the problems, is that the size, the scale, just wasn't conducive to the $40,000 budget that they gave.
Yeah, Michael, the one Mary Washington building that was modeled after the, what was it, building at Radford?
Yes.
Was that like a eureka moment on your part, or how did you find that out anyway?
David Robinson, had a lot of discussions with him. We actually had a meeting a few years ago with a lot of kind of Charles Robinson enthusiasts. Believe it or not, they're out there, and it's good. It's a growing number. But we talked about a lot of these things, and so you start to discover, or at least I started to discover, that he designed a number of these other campuses, James Madison, Radford. And then, one of my favorite things to do in my spare time is honestly go to Google Books, Google newspapers, and I just type in stuff. So I type in Charles Robinson, and you start to see all this stuff that pops up, and just kind of sort through it. That's what us archival nuts typically do, right? And so it kind of a lot of fun there. I share my experiences with Noel all the time in terms of the archival stuff I uncover. That's essentially how I found it. And then I started digging a little bit further, and the dates kind of coincided, and I really did say the similarities are too much there, and we know that he was under time pressure, right? He had to get this thing designed quickly. They had to have the engraving ready to put on the actual bulletins to send out to the young ladies, or else they wouldn't have had a school. In fact, they were still furnishing the place when the young ladies walked in, I believe. So it changed to the State Teachers College, I believe around 1927, 28. And I'm glad Alvy's not in the room because he'd probably correct me. But it's about that time. We have some aerials that talk about the Fredericksburg State Teachers College then. It might have been even a little bit before that point.
I dropped off a postcard that I found several years ago. It had a 1940 postmark on it. And I left it at the Alumni Center.
Yes.
That showed the ball center and there, and it used the word normal on it.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
I left it tonight at the Alumni Center.
Oh, that's it. I'll have to take a look at it because the 28 images of which I referred to, they actually had the young ladies out there putting, I guess, I don't know, sticks or whatever, but FSTC, so Fredericksburg State Teachers College. Now, some of you do remember maybe the plates, and they're actually reproductions that are still on Monroe Hall that have the Fredericksburg Normal and Industrial School insignia actually still on the escutcheon plates. And so there are still vestiges of that, and my guess is that people were, just like today, Mary Washington College, we still see ourselves calling it that from time to time, right? Yep. So excellent question.
Is there a reason that none of the buildings start on the first floor?
I was made aware that you might ask that question. I think a lot of it has to do with obviously labeling these sub-basements would be difficult, and we do have a lot of topography changes here. So I think, Mike, you mentioned, which makes perfect sense, that you've got 3 levels on Mason because of the topography change there. And subfloor basement 1, 2, and 3 doesn't have quite maybe the same ring to it, right? So you don't tell your parents you live in sub-basement or floor 3, right, and expect them to pay the tuition, right? Sounds a lot better floor 1, right, 2 and 3. Any other questions?
How does Betty Lewis dormitory fit into all of this?
Interesting. Yeah. So Betty Lewis is kind of it's kind of rogue. Stepchild, and it actually is. It's built kind of using private money and then leased by the university or the college at the time. So it wasn't a Robinson design, but it was more of a kind of for-profit enterprise, similar to the Kenmore apartments that we find on Kenmore Avenue as well. And so the university leases it for a number of years as dormitories. And the style is in keeping with what you'd expect to see, with Mary Washington. But that's in general how it kind of fits in. And then when they add new dormitories, they kind of they end the lease and they convert those to apartments. But yeah, it served that function. You get a number of structures actually around the area. Spotswood Hall, right? Served as dormitories for a number of years before it became the Alumni House and then passed back into private hands.
Did he design any other buildings in Fredericksburg?
None that I know of off of campus. That's not to say that he didn't participate with some. And you'll see that a lot of his designs influence other structures in town. So for instance, Seacobeck Hall, if you go down to it's the Executive Center on Princess Anne, the northern part, and was it the George Washington Executive Center, but originally built, I think, as Stratford Hotel. If you look at just the floor plan of that building, it's eerily similar to Seacobeck. So, and they're built around the same time. So who's aping who, I don't really know. But there is that. The other kind of interesting thing is, of course, he's designing all over Virginia. And he has this inn. He's actually really good friends with Chandler. And actually was good friends with Russell, too. So, you know, really kind of looking at the campus as his primary design. And we don't see, I don't, or haven't found a number of other structures in town. But it's a great question.
Okay, we have one from the online audience. Tyler Hall at Radford is just like Willard. Which came first?
I'm not familiar with Tyler Hall, but I will say because of Robinson's tenure in Virginia starting in 2006, we see Willard Hall in 2008 or 2009. Probably Willard Hall, then followed by Radford, because I believe their school design follows our post-States Mary Washington. So again, I'd have to do the research, but that's my take on it. Any other questions? You guys are ready for dessert, right?
All right, can we give one last round of applause for Michael Spencer?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. Can I move out of my bubble here?
You can move out of your space. Thank you all for coming this evening. This is the last Mary Talk of the academic year. We will start again next academic year, as well as we will have a few during reunion weekend for those of you who are interested. The night is not over. There is, for those that are in the room, there's a dessert reception out in the lobby. For those online, sorry you can't participate in the dessert reception, but thank you for participating and have a great night.
Hey, oh, no problem.
Let me get you turned off here. That was really, really great. Good job.
Hey, Jamie, good to see you.